So I want you to imagine for a second that you have exactly 10 days to find billions of rupees.
Right. Just a casual Tuesday.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, if you don't find it, the entire nation's economy could literally just, well, it could seize up.
Completely.
We're talking salaries for millions of government workers stopping instantly, massive infrastructure projects grinding to a halt, just widespread panic across the financial markets.
It's a terrifying scenario.
And the thing is, you aren't like a bank robber trying to pull off some massive heist. And you're not a corporate CEO scrambling for a bailout. You are the Reserve Bank of India.
Right.
And your overarching checking account for the sovereign government is overdrawn.
Yeah, and like I said, it's a terrifying scenario, especially if you don't understand the mechanics behind it. But the reality is, managing that level of systemic risk, preventing that exact doomsday scenario, is basically a daily operational reality for central bankers.
It's just their 9 to 5.
Exactly. It's not some abstract theory. It is a highly mechanized, deeply structured process.
And that is exactly what we are plunging into today. So welcome to a highly customized deep dive. Today, we have a very specific, highly critical mission for you, the listener.
Because you are the learner today.
Right. You are the learner. You're staring down a comprehensive high-stakes exam. And your objective for this deep dive is complete, unquestionable mastery of Chapter 16 from the Reserve Bank of India documentation.
Which is officially titled Public Debt Management, though, you'll frequently see it referred to in the literature as internal debt management, so keep an eye out for both terms.
Good tip. And we should establish right now that while a phrase like sovereign debt and cash management might sound, well, a bit dry.
I mean, it conjures images of accountants counting beans in a windowless basement, right?
Exactly. But it's absolutely anything but that. This is the fundamental engine room of a nation.
It really is. It's the invisible, pulsing force that maintains macroeconomic stability for over 1 billion people. If this engine sputters, even for a moment, the consequences are immediate. They're severe, and they're felt by everyone from, global institutional investors down to the person buying vegetables in a local market.
Yeah. So because you're prepping for this exam, we are going to structure this deep dive a bit differently to be the ultimate study tool. We're not going to just, read a list of facts at you like a table of contents.
Because if you wanted a textbook, you'd just read the textbook.
Right. Instead, we're going to organically construct a highly detailed, text-based mental blueprint. Our goal is to make this audio session so exhaustive, so structurally sound, that once you have this blueprint visualized in your head, you'll understand the why and the how so deeply that you will never need to reread the actual chapter again.
It's a much more effective way to learn, honestly. We're moving from passive consumption of data to an active architectural mapping of concepts. We need to understand the causality of the system.
So let's start building that architecture right at the foundation. If we had to distill this entire complex chapter into a definitive core concept like a title for our mental blueprint, what are we actually looking at here?
If I were to title this blueprint, I would call it The Sovereign Ledger, RBI's blueprint for public debt and cash management.
The sovereign ledger. Oh, I love that. Sounds very authoritative.
It does, right. I think it captures both the massive scale, the sovereign level, and the dual, somewhat competing nature of the role, managing debt and managing cash.
Okay, so listener, keep that phrase in your mind. The sovereign ledger. Now break that down for me. What is the actual objective of this ledger? Give me the definitive 2-sentence summary of what the RBI is trying to achieve.
Okay, here's the first sentence, and this focuses purely on the debt side of the equation. Are you ready?
Go for it.
Sovereign debt management is the strategic process of raising required government funding while achieving cost optimization, risk mitigation, and the development of a liquid domestic securities market.
Okay, let me just pause and unpack that.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of tension in that one sentence. Raising the required funding, so getting the money.
Right.
Achieving cost optimization, getting the money as cheaply as possible. Risk mitigation, making sure getting that cheap money doesn't blow up the economy.
Exactly.
And then the development of a liquid domestic securities market, which means ensuring there are always buyers and sellers actively trading these bonds.
Yes, that's crucial.
But that sounds like a paradox to me, because usually the cheapest debt is short-term debt, right? But relying entirely on short-term debt is incredibly risky.
Precisely. That is the fundamental tension of sovereign debt. If you only optimize for cost, well, you just issue 90-day treasury bills for everything.
Right.
But then you have massive rollover risk. What if the market freezes in 90 days? How do you pay it back? Conversely, if you only optimize for risk, you issue 50-year bonds for everything.
Which locks in safety.
It locks in safety, yeah, but it is incredibly expensive because investors demand a higher yield, a higher interest rate to lock their money away for half a century. The RBI constantly has to thread that needle.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. So what about the second sentence of our core objective?
Sentence 2 focuses on the immediate operational reality. As the statutory debt and cash manager, the Reserve Bank of India meticulously balances the temporary liquidity mismatches of the central and state governments while structuring long-term debt to ensure a stable macroeconomic environment.
Meticulously balances temporary liquidity mismatches. I really want to zoom in on that phrase for you, the listener, because
Yeah,
it is the key to this whole system.
it really is.
Think of the RBI as the ultimate financial juggler. One hand is constantly managing the daily cash flow. It's making sure the government's checking account doesn't bounce when it needs to, say, pay military salaries or fund a highway project today.
Right, the immediate needs.
That's the cash management side, fixing those temporary mismatches.
Hmm.
But the other hand, that hand is managing the long-term mortgage. It's issuing bonds, thinking about the next 10, 20, or even 50 years. It is a constant, dynamic, high-wire balancing act.
That is a highly accurate analogy, because if the RBI only focused on the daily cash, the long-term debt profile would eventually spiral completely out of control.
Right.
But if they only focused on the long-term 50-year horizon, the government might default on its daily obligations next Tuesday. They have to execute both functions simultaneously and flawlessly.
But wait, why are there mismatches in the first place? I mean, the government collects taxes. It spends money. Why does the checking account ever drop to zero?
Well, this brings us to a critical cause and effect relationship in the text. Let's call it the liquidity mismatch driver.
Okay, mismatch driver.
It really just comes down to the simple reality of timing. Because government tax revenues and government expenditures do not align perfectly on a daily basis, temporary mismatches occur.
Oh, like how I pay my rent on the 1st, but I don't get paid until the 15th.
Exactly. Think about corporate taxes or income taxes. They're often collected quarterly or annually, so you have massive inflows of cash happening on very specific dates.
But the spending doesn't stop.
No, the government's expenditures, paying salaries, funding public welfare programs, keeping hospitals running, those are daily, relentless outflows.
So you have lumpy income and perfectly smooth, constant expenses. Because of that fundamental mismatch, you eventually hit days where the cash going out exceeds the cash sitting in the account.
Exactly. And that temporary mismatch leads directly to the necessity of a specific financial tool called the Ways and Means Advances, or WMA.
Okay, Ways and Means Advances, WMA. Listener, this is a massive piece of terminology for the exam. Let's define this perfectly. What exactly is a WMA?
So for your exam prep, here is the precise definition you need. Ways and Means Advances, or WMA, are uncollateralized advances granted by the RBI under Section 17(5) of the RBI Act to central and state governments to tide over temporary mismatches in their receipts and payments.
Uncollateralized. That is the magic word there. I really want to emphasize that for the listener. Uncollateralized means the government does not have to put down an asset like gold or property to get this cash advance.
Right, they don't have to pawn anything.
So mechanically, a WMA is essentially just a massive sovereign credit card.
That is a very functional way to look at it, yeah. It's a revolving credit facility. The government needs cash today. They draw down on the WMA. The RBI provides the liquidity. And then when the tax revenues finally arrive next week, the government pays the WMA balance back down.
But just like a personal credit card, you can't just swipe it infinitely. There has to be a credit limit, right? Otherwise, a fiscally irresponsible government could just live on the WMA forever and never actually collect taxes.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, there are strict prescribed WMA limits, and this is where the RBI acts as a highly disciplined risk manager. They don't just wait for the government to max out the credit card. They have an early warning system built in.
Okay.
And this is a vital statistic you must memorize for the exam. 75%. 75%. What happens at that specific threshold?
When the central government utilizes 75% of its WMA limit, it acts as a tripwire. The RBI may automatically trigger a fresh flotation of market loans.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm fully wrapping my head around the mechanics of that 75% trigger.
Sure.
If I have a personal credit card with a $10,000 limit and I spend $7,500 of it, my bank doesn't automatically take out a 10-year personal loan. in my name to pay down the card.
No, they don't.
But that is essentially what the RBI is doing for the government, right?
It's a brilliant analogy, and yes, that is essentially the mechanism. The RBI sees that the short-term uncollateralized credit is getting dangerously high.
Is getting too hot.
Right. So to prevent the government from maxing it out and defaulting on its daily obligations, the RBI steps into the broader financial market. They issue long-term bonds, raise fresh cash from investors, and use that cash to replenish the government's checking account, bringing the WMA utilization back down to a safe level. Wow, so it's automated, sovereign-level risk management. The cause is hitting 75% capacity. The effect is triggering long-term market borrowing to prevent a short-term liquidity crisis.
Precisely.
But what if that system fails? What if the markets are frozen, the WMA hits 100%, and the government still needs money to keep the lights on?
Well, then we enter the realm of the overdraft. And this brings us back to that terrifying scenario we opened the show with. If a government exceeds its prescribed WM limit, it officially enters overdraft, or OD.
And the RBI does not treat an overdraft lightly. This isn't a friendly, oops, you overdrew your account, here's a $35 fee.
No, not at all.
There are incredibly strict, hard-coded time limits. So let's map these out, because understanding these timelines is essential for the exam.
The timelines are designed to force immediate fiscal discipline. For the central government, if they enter into an overdraft, they must clear it within 10 consecutive working days.
10 days. I really want the listener to feel the weight of that. You are the national government of one of the largest economies on Earth, and you have 10 working days to find enough revenue to pull your accounts out of the red.
It's a very tight window.
That is staggering. What about the state governments? Does a state like Maharashtra or Kerala get the same 10 days?
Interestingly, no. The state governments actually have slightly more breathing room in a single stretch, but it is heavily regulated over the medium term. A state can be in overdraft for a maximum of 14 consecutive working days.
Okay, wait. Let me push back on this. I'm genuinely confused by this dynamic.
Okay.
Why would a regional state government get 14 days, but the sovereign national government, the entity that theoretically has the most power, only gets 10 days? Shouldn't the national government get the most leeway?
It seems counterintuitive at first glance, but it actually makes perfect structural sense.
How so?
The central government has vastly more tools at its disposal. It has a much larger tax base. It can alter national macroeconomic policy. And frankly, its debt issuances are the benchmark for the entire country. If the central government is in overdraft for more than 10 days, it signals a catastrophic systemic failure of national revenue.
Like the whole system is broken.
Exactly. A state, however, is subject to much more localized shocks, maybe a natural disaster or a sudden collapse of a local industry. A state might legitimately need 2 weeks to reallocate internal funds or just wait for a federal grant to clear.
Okay, that makes sense. The state is more vulnerable to localized timing issues. But a state can't just abuse that 14-day rule, right?
What do you mean?
Well, they can't be in overdraft for 14 days, clear for 1 day, and then go right back into overdraft for another 14 days, can they?
Absolutely not. That is where the second constraint comes in. While they get 14 consecutive days, there is a hard, unyielding cap of 36 days in a quarter where they are allowed to be in overdraft.
Oh, wow. So in a 90-day quarter, you can only be broke for 36 of those days? But honestly, if a state is genuinely out of cash and their local economy is faltering, cutting them off after 14 days just guarantees a default? Isn't the RBI just shooting itself in the foot with a timeline that strict?
It's the ultimate stick to prevent moral hazard.
Moral hazard.
Right. If there's no hard limit, politically driven state governments might simply choose to never balance their budgets. They would just rely on the RBI to endlessly print money to fund their deficits, which would trigger hyperinflation and destroy the currency.
That makes sense. It forces their hand.
Yes. The 14-day limit forces the state to make hard political choices, cutting spending, raising local taxes, or selling state assets. And the enforcement mechanism is absolute. If a state fails to clear the overdraft in 14 days, the RBI will literally stop processing payments on behalf of that state.
Wow. The ATMs freeze, the checks bounce. That is the nuclear option.
It is. And that is why cash management is monitored not weekly, not monthly, but daily.
Now, obviously, nobody wants to trigger the nuclear option. So the text outlines that the states actually have a safety net before they even touch the uncollateralized WMA credit card. They have a completely different first line of defense that the central government doesn't use.
Correct. The states must first utilize the Special Drawing Facility, or SDF.
Okay, definition time for the mental glossary.
Ugh.
What is the SDF?
The Special Drawing Facility, SDF, is a collateralized advance specifically for state governments, granted against their holdings of government securities, such as the CSF, GRF, or auction treasury bills.
Collateralized advance. Okay, so if the WMA is the uncollateralized credit card, the SDF is a secured loan, like a home equity line of credit.
Precisely.
You have to pledge an asset you already own to get the cash.
Yeah.
And you mentioned two acronyms there that are absolutely vital for the exam, CSF and GRF.
Yes, very important.
We need to explain these thoroughly, not just define them. Let's start with CSF. What is it?
CSF stands for the Consolidated Sinking Fund. In simple terms, this is a massive buffer fund, a dedicated savings account maintained by the states with the RBI. Its specific purpose is for the amortization of all loans.
Amortization. Let's ELI 5, they explain it like I'm 5.
Okay.
Amortization basically means paying down the actual principal of a debt, right? Not just the interest.
Exactly. When a state takes out a loan, they know they eventually have to pay the principal back. Instead of just hoping they magically have 1 billion rupees lying around in 10 years when the bond matures, fiscally responsible states put a little bit of money into the Consolidated Sinking Fund every single year.
Ugh.
It is a dedicated national piggy bank for debt repayment. And the text notes that this fund covers the amortization of all loans, including bank loans and NSSF liabilities.
NSS. Let's define that acronym too, so no one gets tripped up on the exam.
NSSF is the National Small Savings Fund. In India, citizens can deposit money in post offices or specific government savings schemes. This money goes into the NSSF, and the government essentially borrows from this pool of citizen savings to fund its operations.
Oh, I see.
So the state's liability to the NSSF is a major component of its overall debt, and the CSF helps ensure they can pay the citizens back.
Okay, so the CSF is the piggy bank for known debts. You know they're coming. What is the GRF?
GRF stands for the Guarantee Redemption Fund. This is the second buffer fund maintained by the states. But unlike the CSF, which is for known scheduled debt, the GRF is maintained to meet contingent liabilities.
Contingent liabilities. Let's create a scenario for this so it really sticks in the listener's mind. A contingent liability means a debt you only have to pay if a specific contingency, a specific event happens.
Correct. Imagine a state wants to build a massive new toll highway. They create a separate state highway authority to build it. The highway authority goes to a bank and asks for a huge loan. The bank says, well, we will only lend you this money if the state government guarantees the loan. If you, the highway authority, go bankrupt and can't pay, the state government promises to pay us.
So the state isn't actually borrowing the money itself, but it is co-signing the loan.
Exactly. That co-signature is a contingent liability. If the highway authority is successful and pays its own debt, the state pays absolutely nothing. But if the highway authority defaults, that is the contingent event, the state is suddenly on the hook for billions.
Ouch.
Right. The Guarantee Redemption Fund is basically a self-insurance policy. The state sets money aside in the GRF just in case one of those entities it co-signed for goes belly up.
I love how clear that is. So listener, CSF is the savings account for the mortgage you know you have to pay. GRF is the emergency fund in case your kid crashes the car you co-signed for.
That's a perfect real-world translation.
Now, here's where this system gets incredibly elegant. The RBI doesn't just mandate that states have these funds. They actively financially reward states for being fiscally responsible.
They do.
And this brings us to a massive set of vital statistics. The interest rate, penalties, and rewards. Let's map out the exact cost of borrowing across all these different tools. I'll throw out the scenario, you give me the exact interest rate.
Let's do it.
All right, scenario 1. The central government is using its uncollateralized WMA credit card, but they are within their limit and it's been less than 3 months.
The interest rate charged for central WMA is simply the repo rate for up to 3 months.
Okay, let's pause and make sure we all understand the baseline. What is the repo rate?
The repo rate, or repurchase rate, is the baseline interest rate at which the central bank, the RBI, lends short-term money to commercial banks. It is the fundamental anchor for all interest rates in the economy. So, in this scenario, the central government is just paying the standard wholesale cost of money, no penalty.
Got it. Scenario 2. The central government blows past its WMA limit and enters the 10-day overdraft danger zone. What is the cost?
The penalty is immediate. The rate for central OD becomes the repo rate plus 2%.
Repo plus 2%. Wow, that is a massive premium when you are talking about billions of rupees. It is definitely designed to hurt.
It is.
Now let's switch to the states. Scenario 3. A state government experiences a liquidity mismatch, but they have been fiscally responsible. They have a robust consolidated sinking fund, the CSF, or Guarantee Redemption Fund, the GRF. They use the special drawing facility, the SBF, to borrow against those funds. What is their rate?
Now, this is the reward mechanism. The rate for state SDF when collateralized against the CSF or GRF is the repo rate minus 2%.
Let that sink in for the listener. Repo minus 2%. They're literally borrowing below the baseline cost of money.
Yes.
The RBI is effectively subsidizing this loan. It's a negative premium. That is brilliant. They're essentially saying, because you saved money for a rainy day, we're going to make your emergency loan on that rainy day incredibly cheap.
Exactly. It heavily incentivizes states to lock away capital in these buffer funds instead of spending it on, say, short-term political projects.
Right, buying votes before an election.
Right. It is behavioral economics applied at a macroeconomic level, and there is a slight variation you should know. If the state uses the SDF but collateralizes it against auction treasury bills instead of the CSF or GRF, the rate is repo rate minus 1%. Still a discount, but slightly less of a reward than using the dedicated buffer funds.
Fantastic. Okay, scenario 4. The state has exhausted its SDF. It has completely drained its buffer funds. Now it has to rely on the uncollateralized state WMA credit card. What is the cost?
For state WMA, the rate is the repo rate for up to 3 months. However, if that advance extends beyond 3 months, a penalty kicks in to discourage long-term reliance on short-term debt, and the rate becomes repo rate plus 1%.
Wait, I am looking at these stats, and I'm a bit confused by the logic here.
Okay, what's the confusion?
Why is the state penalty for long-term WMA, which is repo plus 1%, actually lower than the central penalty for overdraft, which is repo plus 2%? We established earlier that the center has more power and a larger tax base. Shouldn't the sovereign national government get the best rates, even in a penalty situation?
Ah, I see. You have to compare apples to apples here.
Okay.
The repo plus 2% for the center is for an overdraft, an unauthorized breach of the limit. The repo plus 1% for the state is for a WMA extension, an authorized loan that is simply taking too long to pay back.
Oh, I missed that distinction.
Right. If a state actually enters an overdraft, exceeding its WMA limit entirely, its penalty also scales up severely. The overarching principle is that unauthorized breaches are punished much more harshly than authorized, but lingering debt.
Okay, that clarifies it perfectly. So we are building a matrix here organically. Let's explicitly lock in a comparative matrix for central versus state cash management, because this is prime territory for trick questions on an exam.
Oh, absolutely.
If an examiner wants to see if you actually understand the system, they will ask you to contrast these two entities. Let's summarize the differences across 4 specific vectors. First vector, statutory basis. Like, why are they legally allowed to do this?
For the center, the statutory basis for cash management is mandatory, derived directly from Section 20 and 21 of the RBI Act. For the states, it is fundamentally different. It is voluntary, done by mutual agreement under Section 21A of the RBI Act.
Wait, Section 21A is an agreement. Does that mean a state doesn't legally have to use the RBI to manage its debt?
Theoretically, yes. The Constitution of India grants states the executive power to borrow upon the security of the consolidated fund of the state. However, practically, every single state government has entered into an agreement under Section 21A for the RBI to handle their debt.
Why wouldn't they just do it themselves?
The expertise and market access the RBI provides are simply impossible for an individual state to replicate. But legally, it is an agreed-upon relationship, not a mandated constitutional one.
Fascinating nuance. Okay, second vector in our matrix. First line of defense when cash is low.
The sender goes straight to the uncollateralized WMA. The states must exhaust their collateralized SDF before touching their WMA.
Sender goes straight to credit. States must use their savings first. Third vector, overdraft limits.
As we discussed, the center has 10 consecutive working days. The states get 14 consecutive working days, with a maximum cap of 36 days per quarter.
And the final vector, which we actually haven't discussed yet, surplus investment. We've spent all this time talking about what happens when they run out of money.
True.
But what happens on tax day? What happens when the government suddenly has billions of extra rupees sitting in the checking account? They don't just leave it there earning 0 interest.
Absolutely not. Idle cash is wasted capital. When the central government has a surplus, it is invested in variable rate repo, VRR, or fixed rate reverse repo, FRRR.
Let me quickly define reverse repo for the listener. If the repo rate is the rate the RBI charges to lend money to banks, the reverse repo is the rate the RBI pays to borrow money from the banks. In this case, the central government is acting like the bank, lending its surplus cash back into the market to earn a yield.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the states. When a state government has a surplus, it is invested in 14-day intermediate treasury bills. And here's the crucial data point for the exam. These bills are discounted at the reverse repo rate minus 2%.
So the states earn a bit less on their surplus than the baseline rate. All right, that is a rock-solid comparative matrix.
I agree.
Now, let's pull the camera way back. We've been deeply in the weeds of daily cash management, WMAs, SDFs, overdrafts. This is the hand juggling the daily cash. We need to look at the other hand.
A hand managing the long-term mortgage.
Yes, if short-term WMA debt isn't enough to fund a massive infrastructure project, the government has to issue actual long-term bonds. This is sovereign debt management. And the text introduces a master framework for this called the MTDS.
Yes. The medium-term debt management strategy, or MTDS. You must know the 3 pillars of this framework. They guide every long-term bond issuance. The pillars are cost optimization, risk mitigation, and market development.
We talked about the tension between cost, which is short-term, and risk, which is long-term, earlier. But how do they actually manage the existing portfolio of debt? A country has debt spanning decades. It's a messy portfolio.
It is very messy.
The text mentions a process called consolidation, and it breaks down into passive and active. Define passive consolidation.
Passive consolidation is the process of improving debt portfolio stability primarily through the reissuance of existing bonds. It is critical to note a vital statistic here. This process accounts for nearly 95% of all issuances.
Wait, 95%. So 95% of the time, they're just reissuing bonds that already exist in the market.
That's right.
Okay, to help you conceptualize this, listener, think of passive consolidation like simply renewing an existing lease on an apartment. Your 1-year lease is up. You sign a piece of paper to renew it for another year at a similar rate. It's routine. It stabilizes your housing situation without much friction. It doesn't require finding a new building. And it's what you do 95% of the time.
A very apt metaphor. It provides liquidity to specific benchmark securities without creating a fragmented market of thousands of different tiny bonds.
But then there is the other 5%. Define active consolidation.
Active consolidation is improving debt portfolio stability through deliberate structural actions like switches and buybacks.
So if passive is renewing the lease, active consolidation is like deliberately breaking your lease, taking out a new mortgage, or trading in your current house for a new one specifically to get better terms or alter your timeline.
Yes, it's a structural shift.
But mechanically, why would the RBI do this? If 95% of the time they were just rolling over old debt, why do they even need an active strategy? Why go through the hassle of a switch or a buyback?
Because of a concept called maturity bunching. Imagine a scenario where, purely by coincidence of historical issuance, 30% of the entire national debt is scheduled to mature or come due in the year 2030.
Oh, wow. That would be a nightmare. You would have to find trillions of rupees to pay back investors all in one single year.
Exactly. If the market is experiencing a liquidity crisis in 2030, the government might default, or they'd be forced to refinance that massive chunk of debt at excruciatingly high interest rates. So the RBI engages in active consolidation well before 2030.
What do they actually do?
They will execute a switch. They will go to investors holding those 2030 bonds and say, look, we will buy back your 2030 bond today, and in exchange, we will give you a brand new 2040 bond, perhaps with a slightly adjusted yield to make it attractive.
Ah, so they are actively smoothing out the timeline. They're taking that massive spike of risk in 2030 and spreading it out across the next decade so the repayment schedule is manageable.
Precisely. They are actively manipulating the yield curve and the maturity profile to mitigate long-term risk.
Okay, we have covered the concepts, the timelines, the terminology, the statistics, and the matrices. Now we really need to look at the people.
The players on the board.
Right. Who is actually sitting at the desks executing these multi-billion rupee switches and monitoring the 75% WMA tripwires? Let's map out the important figures and names, the organizational players. Let's start with the architects at the RBI.
The central brain of this operation is the Internal Debt Management Department, or IDMD. This is the central office department situated within the RBI. Their mandate is to carry out the core public debt management function.
So they're the big picture guys.
Yes. They are the ones who design the overarching market borrowing program, the MBP, they determine the strategy, and they maintain the central accounting and reporting.
IDMD is central command. But they aren't the ones physically handing out bond certificates to regional banks, right? Who is the operational muscle out in the field?
That responsibility falls to the Public Debt Office, the PDO. The PDO operates at the various regional offices of the RBI across the country. They handle the gritty, day-to-day operational matters, the actual issuance of debt certificates, managing the registries, and ensuring the local plumbing of the system functions.
So if IDMD is the architect drawing the blueprints, the PDO is the construction crew laying the foundation.
That's a great way to remember it.
Architect and construction crew.
Got it.
But wait, the RBI manages the debt, but the government of India is the entity that actually creates the debt by running a deficit. How do they coordinate if the Ministry of Finance decides they want to borrow ₹1 trillion tomorrow to build high-speed rail, but the IDMD knows the market can't handle it? Who wins that fight?
Well, that potential conflict is exactly why the third organizational body exists. It is the Monitoring Group on Cash and Debt Management, or MCGDM. This is a vital standing committee. Their role is to decide on broad policies and formulate the specific half-yearly borrowing calendar, essentially deciding exactly how much debt will be sold in the next 6 months.
And who sits on this committee?
For the exam, you must know its specific leadership structure. It is co-chaired by the Secretary of the Department of Economic Affairs, representing the Ministry of Finance, the Government of India, and the Deputy Governor in charge of IDMD, representing the RBI.
I really want to highlight the genius of that structure. They are forced to co-chair. You have the borrower, the Ministry of Finance, sitting directly across the table from the inflation fighter and debt manager, the RBI.
Right. Historically, those two roles are at odds.
Yeah. Historically, finance ministries always want cheap money to fund political promises, and central banks always want to restrict money to fight inflation. By forcing them to co-chair the MCGDM, it creates a literal bridge. It prevents fiscal dominance, where the government just forces the central bank to print money, but it also prevents the central banks from starving the government of necessary operating capital. It forces alignment before the borrowing calendar is ever published.
It is an essential governance mechanism. Without it, monetary policy and fiscal policy would be constantly working at cross purposes, just tearing the economy apart.
And finally, the fourth entity. We have the government needing money, the RBI structuring the bonds, but who actually buys them on the open market?
That brings us to the primary dealers, or PDs.
We mentioned them briefly earlier. You noted a historical milestone. The primary dealer system was introduced in 1995. Let's explore why that was such a structural shift. What did the market look like before 1995?
Before 1995, the government bond market in India was largely a captive market. Banks were legally required to hold a massive amount of government bonds to meet statutory liquidity ratios.
So the government didn't really have to work for it.
Exactly. The government didn't really have to sell the bonds in a competitive way. The banks were essentially forced to buy them at whatever artificially low interest rate the government dictated. It was inefficient, illiquid, and it definitely didn't reflect true market interest rates.
So they needed to create a real competitive market where bonds are traded based on actual supply and demand.
Yes. So in 1995, they introduced the primary dealers. These are specialized institutional market makers. Their specific mandate from the RBI is fourfold: to underwrite government securities, to make markets for those securities, to improve secondary trading, and to act as a conduit for open market operations.
Let's break down market maker and underwrite, because those are big finance words.
Yeah.
If the RBI holds an auction on Friday to sell 100 billion rupees worth of bonds, and the broader market is panicking because of global news and nobody wants to buy them,
Yeah.
what happens? Does the auction fail? Does the government just not get its money?
An auction failure is a catastrophic signal. This is why the primary dealers exist and why they must underwrite the issuances. When a PD underwrites an auction, they are legally committing to buy a certain percentage of those bonds even if nobody else wants them.
Oh, wow.
Yes, they act as the buyer of last resort to ensure the government's borrowing program never fails.
So they absorb all the risk. But what's in it for them? In exchange, they get the privilege of being the exclusive middleman, right? Buying directly from the RBI and trading those bonds in the secondary market at a profit.
Precisely. It's a trade-off. And for your vital statistics, you need to know the current landscape. As of September 1, 2024, there are 7 standalone primary dealers, meaning non-bank financial entities dedicated purely to this, and 14 bank primary dealers, which are specialized desks within large commercial banks.
7 standalone, 14 banks. Easy multiples of 7 to memorize. I like it.
It makes it easier for the exam.
So we have the players: IDMD, PDO, MTGDM, and the primary dealers. Now, we teased earlier that this whole system operates on a highly mechanized schedule. It doesn't just happen randomly. The RBI operates the Market Borrowing Program, the MBP. Let's map out the weekly chronological timeline. You need to visualize the calendar for the exam.
The weekly auction rhythm is very strict. Let us walk through the days.
All right, let's start with Tuesday. What happens on Tuesday?
Tuesday is dedicated exclusively to the auctions for dated securities of the state governments. These are the long-term bonds issued by individual states to fund their regional infrastructure or cover their deficits.
State Day on Tuesday. Moving to Wednesday.
Wednesday is the day for Treasury bills, or T-bills. We will define the specifics of a T-bill shortly. But structurally, these are short-term, zero-coupon instruments. This is when the market bids for the short-term national debt.
So states on Tuesday, short-term national on Wednesday. What about Friday?
Friday is the main event. That is when the auctions for dated securities of the central government take place. These are the massive long-term national benchmark bonds that set the yield curve for the entire economy.
Okay, the auction happens on Friday. The primary dealers bid, the yields are set, the auction closes. But when does the money actually move? If I buy a bond on Friday, does the RBI debit my account immediately at that exact second?
No. Financial plumbing takes time, though, much less than it used to. All of these auctions operate on a T+1 basis.
T+1. Trade date plus 1 day.
Correct. If the auction is on Tuesday, the settlement, which is the actual transfer of funds from the buyer's account to the government, and the transfer of the digital security from the RBI to the buyer's demat account happens on Wednesday. If the auction is on Friday, settlement is on Monday, assuming no weekends or holidays intervene.
I want to focus on how that actually works mechanically. Because before the digital era, T+1 meant literally driving paper certificates across town via couriers.
Right, physically moving paper.
Today it happens on a digital platform. The text mentions an acronym, NDSOM. Let's ELI5 that.
NDSOM stands for the Negotiated Dealing System Order Matching. It is the electronic, anonymous, order-driven trading platform operated by the RBI. Think of it as the highly secure, exclusive stock exchange specifically built for government bonds. All the primary dealers and major banks log into NDSOM, place their bids, and the system matches buyers and sellers instantly.
That's incredible.
It is. The T+1 settlement simply means the clearing corporation has one business day to verify the trades, ensure everyone has the cash they promised, and execute the final digital transfer of assets.
T+1 on the NDSOM. Perfect. Now, traditionally, this entire world primary dealers, NDSOM platforms, billions of rupees, has been strictly limited to massive institutional players, banks, mutual funds, insurance companies. But the text highlights two major initiatives to dramatically broaden the investor base, one for foreign investors and one for everyday citizens. Let's map the cause and effect for the foreign investors first.
We can frame this as the foreign investor driver. The RBI recognized a need. Because the RBI needed to broaden the investor base for government securities to bring in more capital to fund national growth, they wanted to attract foreign portfolio investors, or FPIs. However, foreign capital is notoriously known as hot money.
Right, hot money. It rushes in when yields are good. But the second there's a global panic like, say, the 2013 taper tantrum, foreign investors dump their emerging market bonds and pull their cash out, causing massive domestic volatility and currency crashes.
Exactly. So the RBI needed the foreign money, but they desperately needed to mitigate that extreme volatility risk. Therefore, they introduced the voluntary retention route, VRR, and the fully accessible route, FAR.
VRR and FAR, what do those actually do?
The voluntary retention route, VRR, essentially tells foreign investors, look, we will give you easier access and fewer regulatory hurdles to buy our debt, but in exchange, you must voluntarily commit to retain a certain percentage of your investment in India for a minimum period. It turns hot money into sticky money.
I see, sticky money. And the FAR?
The fully accessible route, FAR, designates specific benchmark bonds that have absolutely no limits on foreign investment, concentrating foreign liquidity into specific deep pools rather than fragmenting it across the whole market.
The cause? Need foreign capital without the panic. The effect? Creating specialized regulatory routes like VRR and FAR to control the flow. Brilliant. Now, what about the domestic side? What drove the push toward retail investors?
Let's call this the retail direct consequence. Because there was a stated policy goal by the government and the RBI to democratize the GSEC market, to allow everyday citizens to earn the sovereign yield rather than being forced to go through mutual funds that charge high management fees, the RBI Retail Direct Scheme was launched.
And we have a specific vital statistic date for this, November 12, 2021.
Yes. On November 12, 2021, the scheme went live. This led to the creation of a dedicated web portal where retail investors can open a retail direct gilt, or RDG, account directly with the RBI. For the first time ever, an individual citizen could log in and bid in the primary auctions alongside the massive primary dealers, or trade in the secondary market directly on the NDSOM platform.
Wow. It fundamentally bypassed the traditional banking middlemen for the average citizen.
It was a massive structural change.
All right, we are entering the final, most crucial section of our mental blueprint. We have talked about bonds and securities generically for the last hour. But the RBI doesn't just sell one generic product.
No, not at all.
They have an entire arsenal of highly specialized borrowing instruments designed for different economic environments and different investor appetites. To ace this exam, listener, you need a comparative list of what the RBI can sell to raise money. We are going to build Matrix B, the arsenal of instruments. There are 7 distinct types mentioned in the text. Let's run through them comprehensively, explaining exactly how they work.
Let's do it. Instrument number 1 is the baseline, fixed-rate bonds. These are the most common. They offer a predictable, fixed coupon or interest rate paid periodically, usually semi-annually, until maturity. An example format you will see is 7.10% GS 2034.
What does that actually mean?
This means a government security maturing in 2034 that pays exactly 7.10% interest every year, regardless of what happens in the broader economy.
Vanilla, predictable, safe.
Yeah.
Instrument number 2.
Number 2, floating rate bonds, FRBs. Unlike fixed bonds, the coupon on an FRB resets periodically. In India, it is usually linked to the yield of the 182-day T-bill.
Let's explain why an investor would want this. If I buy a fixed-rate bond at 5%, and suddenly national inflation spikes to 8%, my 5% return is effectively losing me money in real purchasing power.
Exactly. Your real return is negative.
But if I hold an FRB, as inflation rises, the central bank usually raises short-term rates, which means the yield on the 182-day T-bill rises, which means the interest payment on my floating rate bond automatically resets higher. It provides inherent protection against rising interest rate environments.
Precisely. It shifts the interest rate risk from the investor back to the government. Instrument number 3, zero coupon bonds.
This one sounds like a scam if you don't understand the math. Zero coupon literally means it pays 0 periodic interest. Why would anyone buy a bond that doesn't pay interest?
Because of how they are priced. They're issued at a deep discount to their face value and then redeemed exactly at face value upon maturity. The return is the difference between the purchase price and the redemption price.
Give me the exact math on that.
Suppose a zero coupon bond has a face value of 100 rupees and a maturity of 1 year. The RBI will auction it today, and you might buy it for 95 rupees. During the year, you receive 0 interest checks in the mail. But on the day it matures, the RBI hands you 100 rupees. That 5 rupee difference is your implied interest. The classic examples of these in the sovereign market are treasury bills, T-bills, and cash management bills, CMBs.
So you buy it on sale and cash it in at full price. Simple. Instrument number 4, sovereign gold bonds, SGB.
These are unique. They are denominated in grams of gold. They serve as a financial alternative to holding physical gold. Investors pay the issue price in cash, and the bonds are redeemed in cash upon maturity based on the prevailing market price of gold at that future date. Plus, they pay a small periodic interest rate on the initial investment.
Okay, I have to stop and ask, what is the macroeconomic point of this? If an investor wants gold, why not just go buy a physical gold bar? Why does the sovereign government get involved in creating a paper derivative of gold?
Because of India's specific macroeconomic vulnerabilities, India has an immense cultural appetite for physical gold. But India does not mine significant amounts of gold, it imports it. When citizens buy billions of dollars of physical gold, that money leaves the country, expanding the current account deficit and putting immense downward pressure on the value of the rupee.
So the sovereign gold bond is a hack.
It is a brilliant hack.
The RBI tells the citizen, you want exposure to gold prices? Fine, buy this paper bond. If gold goes up 20%, we will pay you 20% more. But the actual cash you use to buy the bond stays inside the country to fund government infrastructure, rather than flying to a Swiss gold refinery. It solves the citizens' desire for gold exposure while protecting the national currency.
Exactly. It is a brilliant piece of financial engineering. Instrument number 5, capital indexed bonds.
Wait, how does this differ from the floating rate bond we discussed earlier? Both seem designed to protect against inflation.
The mechanism is fundamentally different. An FRB adjusts the interest rate based on short-term market yields. A capital index bond protects the actual principal against inflation. The principal amount is directly linked to an inflation index, such as the Consumer Price Index, CPI, or Wholesale Price Index, WPI.
Let me ELI5 those acronyms quickly.
Wow.
CPI is the Consumer Price Index. It tracks the cost of a basket of everyday goods you and I buy, like food and clothing. WPI is the Wholesale Price Index. It tracks the prices of goods traded in bulk by corporations before they reach the consumer. So how does linking to these protect the bond?
Let's say you invest 100 rupees in a capital indexed bond. If inflation, as measured by the CPI, rises by 10% over the life of the bond, the RBI doesn't just give you 100 rupees back at maturity. They adjust your principal up by 10%. They hand you 110 rupees, plus whatever coupon interest was agreed upon. It guarantees a real rate of return, completely neutralizing the erosive effect of inflation.
It is the ultimate safe haven for conservative capital. Instrument number 6, special securities.
These are non-standard bonds issued for highly specific entities or purposes, completely outside the normal market borrowing calendar. The text lists 3 prominent historical examples: oil bonds, UDA bonds for discoms, and fertilizer bonds.
Let's pick one of those to dissect, because UDA bonds for discoms sounds like pure jargon unless you know the backstory. What is a discom and what was the UDA scheme?
Discom is shorthand for a power distribution company. These are the state-level entities that buy electricity from power plants and sell it to households. In India, for complex political and social reasons, discoms frequently sell electricity to consumers like farmers at heavily subsidized rates lower than what they paid to buy the power.
So they are structurally designed to lose money on every single transaction.
Yes. And over decades, these state discoms accumulated catastrophic, crippling debt. They were on the verge of total bankruptcy, which would have meant rolling blackouts across the country. So the government launched the UDA scheme, which stands for Ujjwal Discom Assurance Yojana.
And how do the bonds work?
The mechanism was a bailout via special securities. The state governments were authorized to issue specialized UDA bonds to the banks that held the discom debt. Essentially, the state government absorbed the toxic debt of the discom, converted it into sovereign-backed bonds, and handed those to the banks to prevent a banking crisis. These special securities bypassed the normal auction process because they were issued directly for a systemic rescue.
So special securities are basically the financial fire extinguishers for specific sector meltdowns.
Very well put.
Finally, instrument number 7, a very modern addition.
Sovereign green bonds, SGRBs. The fundamental difference here is not the financial structure, they act like normal fixed-rate bonds, but the restriction on the proceeds. The capital raised from sovereign green bonds is ring-fenced. It can be exclusively deployed only to public sector projects that are actively reducing the economy's carbon intensity, such as massive solar farms or electrified public transit infrastructure.
So if an exam question asks which bond protects your principal from CPI inflation, you know it's capital indexed. If it asks which bond pays no interest during its life, it's a zero coupon. If it asks what tool was used to bail out the power grid, it's a special security under UDA.
Right.
Visualizing this comparative list, alongside the central versus state matrix we built earlier, is the ultimate key to acing any trick questions on the exam. You don't just know the definitions, you understand the tactical use cases for every single weapon in the RBI's arsenal.
The matrices clarify the boundaries between the concepts. It is the fundamental difference between rote memorization of a fact and profound understanding of a system.
All right, let's step back and survey the master architecture we have just built in your mind. We started with the foundation, the core concept of the sovereign ledger. The RBI flawlessly juggling the temporary liquidity mismatches of daily cash with the incredibly complex long-term structural debt. We mapped the terrifying consequences of failure. The strict 10-day central overdraft clock and the 14-day state clock capped at 36 days a quarter. We explored the mechanisms to avoid that failure. The uncollateralized WMA credit card with its 75% early warning trigger and the heavily incentivized collateralized state SDF.
We established the absolute necessity of the buffer funds, the consolidated sinking fund for known amortization, and the guarantee redemption fund for contingent liabilities, and the brilliant repo minus 2% reward structure that encourages fiscal prudence.
We analyzed the MTDS framework for long-term strategy, understanding the difference between passive 95% lease renewal consolidation and active yield curve manipulating consolidation. We identify the architects at IDMD, the regional muscle at the PDO, the vital Ministry of Finance RBI bridge, the MCGDM, and the indispensable 1995 reform that created the primary dealers to underwrite the entire system.
We mapped a mechanical timeline: state bonds on Tuesday, T-bills on Wednesday, central bonds on Friday, all settling on a strict T+1 digital timeline on the NDSOM platform. We discussed how VRR and FR tamed foreign hot money and how the November 2021 retail direct scheme democratized the market.
And finally, we just laid out the 7 specific instruments in the arsenal, from vanilla fixed-rate bonds to the brilliant macroeconomic hack as the sovereign gold bond. That entire structure, that web of causality, is your mental infographic.
It really is a comprehensive architectural view of Chapter 16, studying this logical structure, understanding why a WMA limit exists or why a state SDF is priced the way it is infinitely more efficient than repeatedly rereading the dense prose of the source text.
But before we officially wrap up and let you get back to studying, I want to leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought. Throughout this hour, we have talked extensively about safety buffers. The RBI clearly loves safety buffers.
You do.
In the source text, it briefly mentions a fascinating historical note. The state of Odisha established a unique budget stabilization fund to specifically mitigate the risk of severe revenue shocks. It's an extra layer of safety, a massive sovereign rainy day fund. It sounds like an incredibly responsible, brilliant idea for Odisha. But think about the broader macroeconomic implications.
It raises a profoundly difficult macroeconomic paradox. If every single state in the Union were to mimic Odisha and create massive, isolated, highly conservative stabilization funds, effectively locking away tens of billions of rupees in surplus capital for a theoretical future crisis, instead of deploying it into the active economy today for infrastructure, education, or services, how might that alter the national inflation and growth dynamics?
It's the classic paradox of thrift applied at the highest sovereign level. If an individual saves their money in a mattress, it's good for them, but bad for the economy because that money isn't circulating. If every state government hoards capital to ensure they never, ever trigger that 14-day overdraft limit, they are draining liquidity from the national system. It forces us to ask the ultimate question of sovereign debt management. Does ultimate unassailable safety for the government balance sheet come at the direct cost of overall economic velocity and growth for the country?
It is a delicate, moving target. Over-leverage leads to systemic collapse and overdraft penalties. Over-saving leads to economic stagnation. The Reserve Bank of India exists entirely to navigate the razor's edge between those two disastrous outcomes.
It is the ultimate balancing act. It is something to deeply ponder as you review your mental blueprint tonight. Thank you for taking this incredibly focused, exhaustive, deep dive into your customized exam prep material. We hope this architecture serves you flawlessly. Good luck on the exam.